Super Rugby 2022, folks. The first ever Super Rugby Pacific season. How did the season go now that we've got the season in the bag? We're going to talk about each of the teams, kind of give them a rating out of 10. Like, how do we think they went? What were the positives and the negatives of the season as a whole? We'll go through them. If there's anything I missed, for sure, you guys let me know in the comments below. But, yeah, we'll just start with the season itself. I'm trying to think, like, what are the things that were really positive and negative about the season? Some of the positives, I think the competition adapted as well as it could to the new format. Obviously, they had to change the fixtures list to be kind of Aussie derby matches and New Zealand derbies early with the COVID situation and the lack of travel. It's kind of easy, as we sit here now, with open travel between Australia and New Zealand, to forget that at the start of the season, that kind of wasn't the case. Obviously, Moana Pasifika had a tougher time of it than everyone else, with matches being rescheduled and having to play 2 games in a week kind of thing multiple times. But for the most part, I think the format worked all right. There was a little bit of a disconnect early when the Aussie teams were playing the Aussie teams and the Kiwi teams were playing the Kiwi teams, and it was kind of like, how good are these matches? And was, were Kiwi fans really staying up till midnight to watch the Aussie v Aussie clashes? You know, it's not the original format that was intended, but I think overall the format worked pretty decently. I would say, though, the one thing I don't like about the format is honestly the 8-team playoffs. When you've got 12 teams, you don't need 8 teams in the playoffs. The fact that a team, and I'm sorry Highlanders, the fact that a team with a 4-10 record, 4 wins and 10 losses, makes a quarterfinal is a bit of a joke. Like, I know for the broadcast point of view, more playoff games equals more money. But there wasn't much tension in that last week. It was just which team is going to be 8th. Right? There was more than one team that could have been 8th. If it had been a top 6, I think it would have worked better. You do the old school format of giving the top 2 teams a week off. I've seen multiple people suggest that. I reckon that is also the best potential option. You give teams 1 and 2 a week off, and then the rest of the top 6 have their kind of quarterfinals, and then you've got semi-finals the next week. I mean, you could just go straight to semi-finals. Only the top 4 qualify, but that's a bit cutthroat. The Premiership does that in England, but I think with 12 teams, you only really want the top half qualifying. I don't think that'll change. I think they like having more playoff games. But I mean, the average margin in the quarterfinals was a win by the home team, because all the home teams won. The average was 21 points. Too much. It's too much for mine. So overall, I think the format was good, but I do think the 8-team playoff thing is a bit of a joke. The crowds, I think, is a bit of a mixed bag. You could probably put crowds into a negative. Super Rugby, I think, still struggles with crowd a bit. I do think we still struggle with the perception that the crowds are lower than they are playing in large stadiums. Like, you look at the crowds at Leichhardt, where the Waratahs were playing, and they look phenomenal on camera because the place was packed. Even if that crowd was smaller than one, for example, at Eden Park, it looked way better on camera, because Eden Park, even if it's got 20,000 people in it, still looks well empty. Whereas a sold-out 10,000-seater looks phenomenal. So, yeah, the crowds, I think, were, for the most part, what we expected. Leichhardt was obviously a standout, and the 2 games in Fiji were obviously standouts. I think, hands down, the Fijian crowds were the best of the Super Rugby Pacific season and kind of elevate us to a level that Super Rugby hasn't seen for a long time. Obviously, I think Super Rugby games would benefit from playing in smaller stadiums, but you can't just magic one up out of thin air. There's no way the Blues aren't going to play at Eden Park. Like, Eden Park struggles for business as it is, so they're obviously always going to play at Eden Park. They could move the games around a wee bit more to some of the regional stadiums. They used to do that. We didn't see much of that at the moment, but I know with COVID and everyone being in financial strife, it's kind of easier with all the setup ready to go at places like Eden Park and the Cake Tin and Suncorp and whatnot, that they're not like to move things around a wee bit. So I don't think the crowds are particularly positive. I think they were okay with the Fijian games, especially being the biggest positives. The new teams, I think, are certainly 2 big positives to the competition. There was a little bit of a question mark about how competitive they were going to be. They did finish at the bottom of the log, But I don't think I've heard anyone be like, man, Super Rugby would have been so great if it weren't for those Pacific teams. Nobody's saying that. I think they both added an extra element to the competition. They both picked up a couple of wins. Like, neither went through the season winless. And certainly we've seen some talent get opportunities that we may not have seen otherwise, like especially the Fijian team. Like, I was familiar with a lot of the Moana guys prior to the start of the season, at least in one aspect or another. But the Fijian Drua guys, certainly there's been a whole bunch of talent unearthed for those of us who weren't kind of familiar with them before. So I think they're a big positive, and we can expect them to get better in the future. The Aussie versus New Zealand factor, despite the fact that there's a bit of strife going on between those two in the media at the moment, I think was certainly a big improvement from last year with Super Rugby Trans-Tasman. Trans-Tasman, we saw the Kiwi sides mopping the floor with the Aussie sides. It was still dominated by the Kiwi teams, but it was way more even this year than it was last year. You saw the Brumbies come into New Zealand, getting a win against the Chiefs and the Highlanders. Saw the Highlanders dropping multiple games. The Highlanders are their own kind of mixed bag, but you saw the Waratahs knocking off the Crusaders. You saw the Blues only beating the Brumbies with a last-minute drop goal kind of thing. Like, there were a lot of genuinely close matches between the Aussies and Kiwis this year compared to Super Rugby Trans-Tasman. So I think that's also a big one for the positives category. The last one for the competition overall, was it pretty predictable? I think kind of, yeah. Like, I went back and had a look at who the bookies predicted like the top teams to be, and they had it pretty much down pat. They said the Crusaders would be first. Now, they finished second on the log, but they still won the competition, so you could say that's a right call. They said the Blues second, they said the Chiefs third, so they got the first three kind of pretty much bang on the money. They had the Brumbies a bit underrated, they had the Reds a bit overrated, but for the most part, the competition was relatively predictable. So, I mean, you guys, if you're a Crusaders fan, you probably don't give one damn about whether it's predictable or not. You just want your team to win, but obviously, I don't know. It's more interesting when the games are a bit less predictable. That being said, the margin, I think the average margin across the season was like, I think home team to win by about 7 or 8 points. So in terms of the games, like throughout the season, not always all that predictable. Right, we're going to quickly run through the teams' ratings and how did they go. Out of 10, starting at the bottom, Moana Pasifika, I'm going to give them an 8 out of 10. I think they had a pretty good season. For all the disruptions with COVID, they still managed to get 2 wins. And the teams they beat were the Hurricanes and the Brumbies. So a quarter-finalist and a semi-finalist. So not too bad. The scalps that they picked up were pretty good. They had a whole bunch of games back-to-back, which didn't help things. They had some Tuesday games, which didn't help their crowd. It would be nice to see them get bigger crowds, but for a first season, for a team put together, I think they did all right. So a pretty good pass from them. Likewise, the Drua, I'll also give an 8. Probably, I might have given them 7 if not for those crowds, but those crowds give them a big bump. The 2 teams they beat were Moana Pasifika and the Rebels, so they didn't pick up the same scalps that the Moana Pasifika guys got. But it's like sometimes their play was a bit one-dimensional. I think they got figured out a wee bit early on in the competition with the kind of lack of a kicking game at times. But still, I think they had a positive impact on the competition. And as I said, there's a whole bunch of kind of stars from that team that have emerged. So overall, with that crowd especially, I'm going to give them a good pass. Now the Rebels, unfortunately, I scored the Rebels a 4. The Rebels are still a bit disappointing. They weren't predicted to do much this season. They didn't do much this season. So you could say that's like they met their expectations because the expectations were low. But at the start of the season, they were atrocious. They don't really get great crowds in Melbourne, although Melbourne's a really competitive sporting environment with AFL and Storm there as well. So kudos to you diehard Rebels fans who support them year in, year out because they don't give you a lot to cheer about. They beat the Drua, the Force, Moana Pasifika, and the Highlanders. So the Highlanders win is the biggest of that lot. Otherwise, they're kind of beating the teams that were around about the same area as them. So it's kind of more of the same from the Rebels, unfortunately, with a new coaching ticket. If the one positive is they were tracking a bit better as the season went on because they started pretty poorly. Likewise, I'm afraid the Force, I think, also let us down a wee bit. The Force's home record was kind of bad. I think they only won one game at home, which, when you're in Western Australia and people have to travel to you, it's a double-edged sword because it means you got to travel to everyone else. But, you need to make home a fortress, and we didn't really see that from the Force. Unfortunately, they beat the Rebels, the Drua Moana Pasifika away, and then the Hurricanes at home. So a bit of a highlight with that Hurricanes win. But given some of the players they had, I can kind of see why their coach has been replaced, unfortunately, because it was just kind of tracking along without any, big jump of improvement. So fingers crossed, change of scenery will help them. But it was a little bit more of the same from them as well, unfortunately. The Highlanders, I've gone even lower. I've said 3 out of 10, man. The Highlanders were a big old letdown. I know they made the quarterfinals. But, with a coach like Tony Brown, I think we all expected a lot more from the Highlanders this year. Like, they've tended to have a knack of, taking players that may be underrated by other teams and, getting some gold out of it. But we didn't see it this year, unfortunately. They beat Moana Pasifika, the Drua, the Reds, and the Force. So there's no real big scalps in there. The Reds is the biggest scalp that they managed to grab. So again, not really that startling, unfortunately. The Highlanders crowd tends to fluctuate a wee bit depending on how many students are in town. But when it's packed, it's really pumping compared to some of the other New Zealand grounds. But they lost their quarterfinal 35-6. I mean, they were all right until they got a red card, and then that totally stalled their progress overall. I think the Highlanders season, to be fair, was a bit of a stinker. The Reds, I've given them a 5, which is still, I don't know, man. Like, they finished with a positive record, 8-6. They were predicted to be the top Aussie team, which they were not. They were behind the Tars and the Brumbies. They did manage to get a win over the Brumbies, which was actually pretty hard this season because not many teams knocked them off outside the top teams. So, I mean, they just had a bomb end of the season, didn't they? Like, they started the season pretty strongly, and then they just fought the New Zealand teams and just turned to custard. They couldn't beat the Kiwis. I mean, they beat Moana Pasifika, but that was about it. So, I think that was a bit of a deflating end to the season, unfortunately, for the Reds. For the Waratahs, I've given them a 9. Like, what a turnaround. Like, last season, they were hopeless. They were genuinely hopeless last year, and they turned it around to be a side that managed to knock off the Crusaders. In one game, they finished in the playoffs. Their record of 8-6, fantastic. They got those good crowds at Leichhardt. There was everything to like about the Waratahs this season. They had some guys like Dylan Peach and Charlie Gamble, some guys that weren't really that well known last year, have really standout seasons. So, man, they turned things around. They beat the Crusaders and Highlanders in terms of Kiwi teams. They lost to the Blues by 3. They lost to the Hurricanes by 4. So, proper competitive team, the Tars, this year. Obviously, they lost their quarterfinal, but, such a turnaround from last year. You can't not give them a great score. The Hurricanes, I've kind of given them a 5 as well, similar to the Reds. Like, that's a little bit below what they were predicted to be. The bookies had them as the 4th favourite. Like, they still did alright. 8-6 is a positive record. They were the only team to beat the Blues in the regular season, which is a bit of a highlight. But other than that, they struggled against the big teams. Like, they were able to beat the other teams handily enough, but then you lose to the Crusaders twice, you lose to the Chiefs, you lose to the Brumbies. So the teams above them, they again, apart from that win over the Blues, they struggled to win the clutch ones, unfortunately, and then kind of rounded off with that last loss to the Force. Certainly didn't help matters either. The Brumbies, I was torn between a 7 or an 8. I gave them a 7. They were really the highlight of the Aussie teams right until the end of the season let them down a wee bit. They probably should have finished higher than they did, which meant they had to travel to Eden Park for their semi-final, which I don't think helped. 10-4 is a really good record. They beat the Chiefs away, they beat the Highlanders away, so good road wins in New Zealand. They beat the Hurricanes at home. It's the end of the season, man. They lost to the Crusaders and the Blues at home, although the Blues game especially was very close. And then they lost away to Moana Pasifika, the bottom side. So the end of the season, absolutely let them down as well. Like even like the Reds was worse, but yeah, that Moana Pasifika one is really the one I think that I dropped them from an 8 to a 7. That meant they had to play their semi-final away to the Blues. That's a game they probably could have won. I know there was a lot of anger about one last refereeing call, but honestly, the Brumbies, in all fairness, could have had it in the bag prior to that if some other things they'd done right. So it still burns. They lost that game. The season overall, I think 7's still a pass for sure, but it could have been just that wee bit better, eh? The Chiefs, I've also gone with a 7 for the Chiefs. 10-4 record, same as the Brumbies. Same spot they were predicted to get by the bookies, so I guess in that regard they met their expectations. They beat the Crusaders down in Christchurch, which is a great one, but then on the return leg they got well beaten. They got nilled by the Blues at home, so there were certainly some stinking results in there as well. They lost to the Brumbies at home. They lost their semi-final 20 points to 7. So there's... Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be too critical of a team that came third and lost to the Crusaders away in a semi. Like, there's no real shame in that. But, yeah, I think they were just missing that clinical edge, eh? Sometimes passes that needed to go to hand just wouldn't go to hand. So, on another season, like even that game where they got nilled by the Blues, they could have had multiple tries, but just one of those times when it doesn't go your way. Maybe that's kind of a little microcosm of the Chiefs season as a whole. The Crusaders, I mean, I gave them a 9. I personally like the Crusaders a bit more this year because they lost some games they weren't expected to lose. They lost to the Blues in Christchurch. That doesn't happen. They lost 2 games in Christchurch if you include that Chiefs one. That just doesn't happen. They lost to the Waratahs. That's not supposed to happen. But when it comes down to it, do the Crusaders win the clutch games? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no better team to go into a knockout game, a must-win, do-or-die game than the Crusaders. That's why they are the champions of this competition. So, I enjoyed the fact that they did look mortal at times. They looked beatable and they did get beaten. But, the clutch games is where it's at, and that's the Crusaders. The Blues, I mean, I've scored them an 8. They were a letdown in the knockout stages, let's be fair. 13-1, though, regular season record was phenomenal. They set an all-time record for themselves for wins in a row, and there's been some great Blues sides in the past. So that's obviously fantastic. They only lost that one game to the Hurricanes in the regular season. They came close against some of the other teams, but they managed to win the games that they needed to in the regular season to finish top of the log. They squeaked through against the Brumbies, and then they just looked like a fish out of water at times against the Crusaders. So obviously still not all there, but still obviously a pretty positive season for the Blues. If you'd said to the Blues fans at the start of the season, you're going to go 13-1, I don't think any of us would have believed that. If you said we're going to win in Christchurch, I don't think we would have believed that. So as much as there's disappointment weighing us down from that final, I still think you've overall got to look at it and say, man, it was a pretty good season. So there we go, folks. You guys let me know your thoughts. Am I being too harsh on these teams like the Highlanders, the Force, and the Rebels? Am I being too harsh on the Brumbies with a 7? Should they be a wee bit higher? What did you think about Super Rugby Pacific overall as a competition? You guys let me know your thoughts. And if there's any other points I missed, do chuck them in. I will talk to you guys again soon. See you later.